Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each week of this podcast is either a solo episode where I unpack some scholarship in relation to computer science education, or an episode with a guest or multiple guests. In this week's episode, I'm having a conversation with Maya Israel, and we discuss Maya's shift from special education into computer science education, the importance of universal design for learning, UDL, in CS classes. We also discuss understanding the spectrum of accessibility for students with a diverse set of needs, the current status of accessibility and inclusion within the field of CS education. We problematize deficit framings of students with disabilities, and so much more. The show notes include links to other podcasts that are related to this, as well as many other resources. So I recommend checking those out by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, or by going to jaredoleary.com. On my website, you'll find a ton of resources related to computer science education, including a link to bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit that I work for, as well as a bunch of drumming and gaming content, because I like to drum and I like to game. But with all that being said, we will now begin with an introduction by Maya.
I'm Maya Israel. I'm an associate professor of educational technology and computer science education at the University of Florida. I'm also part of an institute called the Institute for Advanced Learning Technologies, and I have a lab called the Creative Technologies Research Lab.
Can you tell me the story of how you got into computer science education?
I actually started as a special education teacher. So if you had asked me back in the way back, I would never say that I was in computer science education. I ended up getting my doctorate in special education, and I was a faculty of special education, really interested in technology to support kids with disabilities. And so that's really been my passion and my research. And one of our projects that we were working on, we were developing educational technologies and video games for kids to help them understand science standards. And we wanted to use a participatory design approach. And so we went into a bunch of classrooms, and this was like way back when iPads were new. Yeah, I know, I'm aging myself. But in any case, we had copies of like the interface of one of the old iPads, and we wanted kids to draw the design of how they would want to interact with an app around learning science standards. And we were analyzing those to help inform our process. Long story short, I started looking at these app designs, these just, paper prototypes, and they were amazing. And I had this aha moment, which is really about, why am I designing tech for kids if they're so amazing at knowing what they want and designing for themselves? And it really shifted the way I was thinking about computer science and computer science education. And so up until then, I was working with app developers and like, let's design this amazing thing for kids and test it with kids. And then I shifted towards, what do kids really need to know and be able to do in order to design technologies for themselves? And that was around 2011. And it just completely shifted my career, because not only did I have to then learn about computer science in general, I had to learn about how to teach computer science. And because of the population of kids that I'm working with, how do you teach computer science to kids who often struggle with learning? And so that took me down a completely different trajectory that I never would have imagined back in the way back.
Yeah, that definitely resonates with me. Like, I took a single class in high school and then nothing until my last semester of my doctorate when taking coursework. And then I was just like, it was this class where you would code music apps. And I was like, when is this music? When is this coding? And when are they inseparable? And I was looking for a job in the area and saw this like random K-8 technology position. And I went in and was like, hey, instead of teaching like Microsoft Office, how about you teach like arts-based coding, etc. And that like one-off little exchange and that little suggestion on my behalf led to a completely different trajectory in my career, in that I've been in here for 8 years now, something like that. So it's funny how like things can be a catalyst for change like that in careers.
Yeah, I think so. And I also feel like all those previous experiences, they add up to what it is that you do, right? So the work that I did around special education, instructional strategies and app development and gaming and all of that is coming into this work, just not in the way I would imagine. It's like you have a puzzle and you don't know what the puzzle is going to look like. And the pieces start to shift, right? As you start to figure out, make sense of the world with all this new information that's coming at you.
Right. I'm curious if you could elaborate on like how did you learn about CS and like how would you recommend others learn about CS if they are new to the content?
So I learned about CS with and from faculty at the University of Illinois. So I connected with folks like George Reese, and then with K-12 practitioners like Todd Lash, who at the time was an elementary school teacher doing coding in his school. And it really was about talking to them, going into their classroom, seeing what they were doing. And for me, that was the way in. I don't necessarily think as a teacher that's the way in because I was already a faculty member at the time. I think right now there's so many different entry points into computer science education. So you think about how do you dip your toe and like learn in a way and at a pace that makes sense for you, whether it's with the hour of code or whether your school has some kind of program or folks that are already doing the work. I would suggest connecting with people. That's really the way to do it. So I made connections, but it wasn't as a teacher. As a teacher, I would find the people in my school, in my district who are doing the work. And frankly, there's so many resources through CSTA and online through Twitter chats that there are ways to do it. I think it's intimidating when you're just starting out, especially if you don't have the infrastructure. So I always say that start slow, try it out, have time for yourself to tinker so that you can gain the comfort. And that's really what I had to do because, I mean, I didn't know computer science. I had this imposter syndrome that many people have in the room with folks that knew a lot more than I did. And it took sitting and playing and asking for help and having that resilience. And then also saying, okay, whatever I'm struggling with are the things that my students are going to struggle with. So this experience is really valid and really valuable because it's showing me where the pain points are.
Yeah, I still get the imposter syndrome to today because it's like, well, I don't have any degrees in this. Like, am I qualified? And it's like, wait, I've done so many things. Yes, I'm qualified. Like, yes, there's still things to learn, but doesn't discredit it.
Exactly.
I'm curious, with disabilities and disability studies, it's a very broad umbrella term that can mean many things. Like some people, when they hear that, they might think, oh, you're working with people who are like blind, like maybe doing like some of the stuff with Andreas Stefik, what he's doing. Or maybe it's, oh, I work with children who have autism. Or maybe it's more like a critical discourse, like type of work where it's unpacking ableism and problematizing it, etc. Like, in what way did you specialize within disabilities research?
When I started off, the only options were when I was getting my degrees was to get a degree in like learning disabilities or behavior disorders, or, you know, at the time, what they called MR, which we would never use anymore. We use intellectual disabilities.
Yep.
And it's really the wrong approach, right? So rather than focusing on instructional strategies focused on a group of kids, what I realized that I was doing, even though we weren't really talking about it at the time, is thinking about what are the functional needs of kids, regardless of the labels, because I'm really not a fan of those labels. But there are some students who struggle with reading. There are some students who struggle with executive function. There are some students who have low vision. But those aren't categories, right? So the strategies that I focus on are like addressing those particular functional needs, regardless of disability, if that makes sense. But the main focus was on the strategies because I was a classroom teacher. So I was always focused on what is it that I can do to support this child feel successful and included. It intersects a lot with the disabilities advocacy piece. So really thinking about not problematizing disability, really looking at the whole child, understanding that a child comes into a classroom with a lot of strengths and some challenges. And so that's the other piece. So it's kind of balancing the understanding of the pedagogical approaches, but also advocating for inclusion and to not have teachers see children as a problem, but to see their, full humanity, right?
Yeah, I appreciate that. There's, in some disabilities research, it's sometimes referred to as like tiny timming, where you like view somebody from a deficit framework and assuming, oh, because you have this disability, therefore you are lesser than and you will never achieve, etc. But then there's also the inverse, sometimes called super crip, where it's like, oh, look at you, you accomplished this thing, and despite all odds, etc. So like, it's interesting looking at the discourse, how it problematizes both ends of those different perspectives. It's also interesting hearing you say that. That makes a lot of sense. Like I read one of your articles on universal design for learning that was talking about like how you could use that in the CS space. I'm curious, could you quickly explain, well, what is universal design for learning? And then like, why might that be useful for CS educators to know more about?
So universal design for learning is an approach to thinking proactively about how to include all learners in a classroom environment. So rather than say, here's my lesson plan, and I'm going to do this other thing, I'm going to have all these accommodations and modifications and adaptations to this lesson plan for that one kid, which tends to otherize those children. The idea of UDL is at the very beginning, as I'm starting to plan, I think about what I want my students to know. And then I think, okay, what are going to be some of the barriers for some of my students? What are going to be some of the preferences that my students are going to want to have? And can I build an instructional lesson or unit that is flexible enough to include everybody? So in order to do that, from a UDL perspective, there are these three principles around, how to instill flexibility. So for example, one of the principles is multiple means of engagement. So knowing that your kids are coming into a classroom with different motivations, right? And then, okay, so how am I going to engage them? And multiple means of representation means that students will want to access information in different ways, depending on the content. So making sure that there are ways for them to hear the information and see the information and engage with the information. And then multiple means of action and expression, which is, can we think about assessing student learning in a way that leverages their strengths and doesn't just highlight their areas of challenge? And so using those three principles, UDL allows us to think more broadly. And in terms of computer science education, I think it fits really well because we talk a lot about providing kids choice and voice and having them express themselves. And so I think that it naturally fits in. On the other hand, it doesn't just happen naturally. A lot of the features of UDL teachers do really well, but then there are some gaps, for example, in thinking about, okay, if I'm going to keep a student engaged, I also have to help them maintain persistence. And for some kids, that's really hard. So how do I help them with that? And so there are strategies for that. So I think it's a really useful, holistic system to think about all kids in a CS classroom. And it doesn't mean that you don't need to individualize for certain children under certain situations. It means that you have to do less of it if you're already doing that. So, for example, if everybody has access to text to speech, then you don't have to have that as an accommodation for one or two kids. Like, why wouldn't that be open to everybody? Or if everybody has access to different metacognitive strategies that you're teaching kids about debugging, then you don't have to explicitly call out a certain child who might really need that, whereas others might also need it, but not need it as much or not benefit from it as much.
Yeah, I like that. So what does an accessible and inclusive CS learning experience look like for you?
So the first thing would go back to what we talked about with universal design for learning. Was it designed for all the kids in the classroom from a pedagogical perspective? The second would be, are the tools accessible? And this is a major, major issue because accessibility is not a clear-cut thing. Some tools that are accessible for some kids are inaccessible for others, and the other way around too. So there's not this like checklist that works for every kid, but the tools have to be accessible to the students in the classroom. Earlier, you mentioned Stefik and some of his work around accessibility, and he has the Quorum programming language, and that's a fantastic tool for students who are low vision. I mean, he's done some work around students with learning disabilities with that too. And for those students, many of the programming languages are inaccessible, especially block-based programming environments, which you can't use any kind of text-to-speech at all in.
Right.
But for other students, the fact that the Scratch blocks, for example, have the color coding that they have, and they have the organization that they have, are exactly what they need in order to access coding because it helps them really think about the organization of code. And they're also not stuck in the syntax of some students with print-based disabilities where the syntax would just really be a challenge for them. So you have to think about who your students are and then think about accessibility for those students in particular. So kind of this idea of what makes an inclusive, accessible learning environment is that combination of like universal design, accessibility, and then the third piece of it is that whatever individualized needs the student has beyond assistive technology or accessibility, those are in place. And so for students, many of the students we work with have accommodations, have IEP goals. And so the idea of thinking about those needs is also a piece of it. And then kind of surrounding all of it is the fact that the students feel like they belong in the computer science classroom. So that sense of belongingness is more than inclusion. Inclusion to me means you're in the classroom, you're accessing the material in the way that you're able to. But belongingness means that you feel like you're part of the classroom community and that the people in that classroom community see you as part of that community as well.
So when I used to teach like pre-service and in-service educators, one of the things that we would frequently talk about is like the multi-perspectivalist nature of how you can't address any group of students the same way. There are many approaches that you need to use for each individual, many pedagogies, projects, ways of differentiating based on tools, etc. But that can be difficult to teach sometimes to other educators. I'm curious if you have any strategies or suggestions for how to help educators work with a variety of students and consider, while this tool might be very accessible for one student, it is completely inaccessible for another, and vice versa for other tools?
Yeah, that's a good question. Advice for other teachers. I think what I would say is to start with some mindsets before we get into the pedagogies. To me, the idea that you have to really believe and commit to including all kids. For many teachers, we have this internal dialogue about, this kid is successful, this kid's doing great, this kid's going to go someplace, and this kid is not. And we may not say it out loud. And so, but it informs the way that we interact with kids. And so this mindset of all kids belong here and have a right to be here, and kind of questioning our assumptions about that when we're looking across a classroom and say, I don't know that this kid really belongs in my classroom. And unpacking that, I think, is the first step. Those mindsets are a place to start. The second piece of that, which is also a mindset, is assuming competence. Before we can do anything, we need to know that our kids are able and capable. And a lot of the mistakes that I see teachers make is that they want their students with disabilities to be successful. So they over support, they over scaffold, they over teach. And it doesn't give students the flexibility and the permission to fail and to create and to engage in computing in ways that other kids do, because we're trying so hard to protect them. And so this idea of assuming competence allows a teacher to say, all right, let's just see where this kid is. And let's use the kid inform me in terms of what he or she needs before I, do anything. And then kind of the next step is to think about UDL and assistive technology, and to think about who are the people around that can help. So as a computer science teacher or a general education teacher who's teaching computing, there are other people in the school building that can be really helpful. So bringing in the special education teachers, bringing in the assistive technology coaches is a step to not have to know everything, because there typically are, if you look, resources for teachers to go to. And then you take your time, you talk to the students, you talk to the students' families, and you work it out together. So the idea is you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to have the curiosity and the commitment to help and to support a child.
Excellent answer. I hope people go back and listen to those different ideas that were given, like especially the first part you're talking about with unpacking the mindsets and the biases that we might have. I think it was both Dweck and Duckworth who mentioned there are studies that would have pre-assigned labels onto students as like, this kid is going to excel or this kid is going to be a future leader, and then like vice versa. And they would just randomly assign those labels to people, and the teacher would like find that confirmation bias of, oh yes, that person is going to fail in life, or oh yes, that person is going to succeed, regardless of if that was just an arbitrary random assignment and whatnot. So it's really interesting how those preconceived notions have a huge impact on like how we help kids and what teachers think about them.
And we all have it, right? So the idea is to acknowledge that, we come into a classroom with our own backgrounds and our own biases and our own previous experiences that inform the way we interact with kids. And so we have to question those assumptions constantly. And I have to do the same thing, in terms of I walk into a classroom, and because I do a lot of research studies in these areas, I know a lot about the kids that I'm about to interact with. And many times that's not always a good thing. And so making sure that I'm able to check myself and really see this child and let the child inform what happens is important.
Yeah, and especially with assuming competence in anything related to technology, there's often this like assumption from a lot of educators where it's like, oh, well, kids are always on TikTok and playing video games, etc. Like, so therefore they understand computer science. It's like, well, there's a difference between using a device and, being able to program a device. Like, those are two different sets of skills and understandings.
Yeah, exactly.
But there's also, like what you mentioned with the over-supporting, though, especially when any kind of disability label is applied, there's this like fear of, well, I want to make sure I help them. And so there is that tendency to over-support as opposed to under-supporting. Like, it's that weird, hard balance to provide once that label is slapped onto it.
So there's a term in special education called least to most prompting. And I find it useful, even though I'm not using it in exactly the correct context. But the idea of least to most prompting is that you start with the least amount of intervention that a child needs in order to be successful. It's almost like a dial that you turn up as a child needs the support. And then you can turn the dial down, a child like gains more competence and becomes more expert in their own learning. And so I like that analogy of the dial. And I like the idea of least to most, because it does assume competency. We don't want to over support if we don't need it, right? If we go to the doctor and we've got a headache, we don't automatically go to the most intensive intervention. We see if there's something we can do. Sometimes deep breathing will do it for us, right? Because I've got anxiety and the anxiety is going to give me a headache. I don't automatically need to go to like a very major kind of drug intervention unless it's needed.
So you're saying I shouldn't have gotten a lobotomy for my headache?
Depends on the week, I guess. There's some weeks.
So if we think broadly and kind of generalize here, where do you think that CS educators as a field are doing really well? And then where is there room to grow when it comes to accessibility and inclusivity?
I feel like we are much further ahead now than we were 5 years ago in our conversation around the inclusion of kids with disabilities. When we were starting this work back in 2011, 2012, the idea of inclusion and students with disabilities was just not part of the computer science education CS for all conversation. And so I feel like we are in a much better place as a community around the discourse related to inclusion of kids with disabilities. I feel like we also have a lot of resources that were developed outside of computer science education that teachers are using and applying in computer science education. And universal design for learning is an example of that. It wasn't developed for CS education, but teachers are using it in the context of CS education. So we have a lot of literature and research studies and practice-based approaches that we can use in computer science. And that's a good thing. Where I think we have a long way to go is in like, how do we take these strategies and really show teachers how to apply them in the context of CS education? So those teachers right now who know those strategies really well, they can adapt them to computer science fairly painlessly. But if you're new to those inclusive practices, there's not a lot out there to help you apply those in computer science education. So I think we've got a long way to go there. So we're doing some of that work, but we need more people who are doing this work to do it together to be able to build this knowledge base and the resources for teachers. So what does a UDL-based CS lesson plan look like, for example? Or how do we think about scaffolding or teaching debugging in a more explicit way? Those are things that we still have a ways to go, but we're getting there. I feel like we are now compared to 5, 6, 7 years ago is fantastic. So I think that folks should feel really encouraged about it. The other place I think we're doing really well is in almost every conversation I have with school districts and teachers, they're committed to inclusion. They really want to do the right thing for students. And so they're coming to professional development and they're coming to learning with many of the mindsets we've already talked about because they just want to be able to have the knowledge and skills to help them meet the needs of all kids. So that to me is a major accomplishment and a good thing for us to remember.
So you mentioned that overall we're better on discourse, but do you feel like there's action, funding, and policy that supports that discourse? Because often with I think of DEI work in particular, the conversation might be more than it was previously, but the action and the funding and the policies that support what's actually being talked about might be where it was previously. And I'm not sure if that's the same with disability research and whatnot.
The funding is definitely starting to emerge. And not only that, but both the National Science Foundation and the Department of Education, IES, have put out calls and have sent the messaging that they want research related to students with disabilities in computer science education. So there have been a couple of Dear Colleague letters where they say, please consider submitting proposals. Here are some funding priorities related to disability. And it's not that there's one pot of money that's a disability pot. It's actually the idea is within all of these funding competitions at the NSF, DRK-12, iTest, CS for All, there are priorities specific to students with disabilities. And there are folks there who are program officers who are committed to shepherding in good proposals that will lead to strong research. And that's been going on for several years. I'm feeling pretty positive about, at least at the NSF and the IES, that there is a commitment to funding these kinds of studies. We definitely need some additional advocacy if we think about philanthropic gift or corporate donations or any kind of foundation funds, where it would be really nice to advocate for those kinds of funds as well. So a lot of the programs that are being developed and are using some of these funds, there isn't as much of a focus on accessibility and inclusion. So it would be wonderful if some of those RFAs or some of those priorities, it's yes, we'll fund you. Here's all this money because you're going to create these amazing resources to be used in schools. But you have to consider accessibility and inclusion. That to me would be a major step forward too, because a lot of the curricula and tools that are available in classrooms in CS education aren't being developed just with NSF funds. There are other funding sources that is not a priority for. And even within NSF, you can apply and build something where accessibility is not a priority. So even though the funds are available to look at students with disabilities, it's certainly not a requirement when it comes to developing tools and resources for classrooms.
It's good that they're matching action with word, at least from a national level. I am curious if there are, whether it be a CS Ed researcher or just a CS educator in a K-12 context, there might be the imposter syndrome that comes with it, with okay, but I don't have degrees in special education. I'm an advocate. I want to help. I want to do research, or I want to make sure when I say CS for All, I really do mean CS for All. But where would you recommend people go to learn more, whether it's books or organizations or articles or whatever?
So the first thing I would say is partner with people around you. So that is important. If you're going to do this kind of work, it's helpful to not just look it up and read about it, but actually connect with people. Some of the most impactful work that happens in our field is because people talk to each other and they work together and they bring in their shared understanding. That would be the first place. I would go to cast.org. I'll send you some things that you can add in the show notes or whatever, but CAST will have a lot of resources around universal design for learning. Our lab website will have a lot of resources around UDL and computer science education. There have been some articles and some book chapters that have been written in this area. So there is a place to find it. Thankfully, because it's such a new field, there's not a ton. So you probably won't feel overwhelmed by looking at the material. But what I'd say is, more than anything, it's about those partnerships. I think I worry when I see researchers do this kind of work where they don't have somebody who understands disability on their teams. Just like when I see CS Ed work and I see computer scientists that don't have education background in general, I get a little bit worried as well, because it's important for us to put a team together that really has that expertise. Otherwise, you end up baking bias and other things into your work without even knowing it.
What are some of the biases or misconceptions that people often have when working with students with disabilities?
So, one of my pet peeves that I hear a lot is if only they weren't so low, they could X.
Huh.
And so this idea, I know it, like, I hear it a lot, and it's shocking because people will talk to me knowing the fact that I do this work, and they're trying to explain to me why a child isn't doing well in their class. And so the misconception is the child isn't performing well in the classroom because of something that's internal and inherent to themselves, rather than something that is designed into instruction. Usually, when a child isn't succeeding in the classroom, the first thing I do, I think, okay, what's not working here? What's not working in the environment, in the way I'm teaching, in the materials? And so I don't think, well, this kid is just too low to get it. But that often is where folks will go when a child is not succeeding in the classroom. We have to really shift the way we think about how to evaluate success and whether a child performing well is because of something inherent within them or whether they are within the right conditions to be able to show that they understand what they know.
Yeah, I just had a lot of flashbacks to when I used to teach music and drumline and whatnot. I would have parents come up to me and be like, well, the previous music teacher said my child would never be good at music because they didn't have an innate ability. And I was like, I'm going to prove them wrong with that statement. That is not true. I was terrible when I started, and it took a lot of effort and I got better. But like, to just label somebody as basically incapable of doing something right off the bat is just highly inappropriate. So yeah, sorry, having flashbacks.
Yeah. And to attribute that to something that's internal to the child rather than the conditions, right? Because there are a lot of things that we can do. I was working in one classroom, and there was this young boy there who, by the way, loved playing computer games. So I knew he was like, he played these math games all the time, but he was also nonverbal. And so he couldn't communicate what he wanted to do. And we were doing some coding, and he was completely disengaged from the coding activity. And there was a paraeducator sitting with him, really well-meaning person who was trying to help him out and essentially took over the computer and was telling him what she was doing. And he just was like completely uninterested in listening to this adult play on the computer. And one of the only things we did is we asked her to keep her hands off the computer and to just talk to him, about what to do. And just the simple intervention of like hands off the computer, he started to, get more engaged in the activity. So the idea is, here's a child who couldn't communicate what he wanted to do, an adult who was very well meaning, who was like, well, let me help you. And what the adult did made the situation worse because, like, why would any kid want to watch a grown up on Scratch? Like, I just can't imagine, the idea of this child isn't disengaged because of the disability. The child was disengaged because he just wasn't interested in what the adult was doing and the activity as it was designed. And so we had to change the way we were doing things. And then, it wasn't the only thing we could do, but it was certainly a piece of it.
Yeah, and the way that you just framed that can be applied to anyone with or without disabilities. Like, I've seen so many instances where kids were not engaged at all, and then you simply reframe the context, apply it in a way that's of interest to them, and suddenly they can't stop doing whatever that is.
Right. And that's the whole idea of UDL, right? You're doing something because you want to increase the range of kids that you're getting.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, it's not just good for students with disabilities. It's really a good framework for all the students because we want to engage all the kids, and we can't assume that they're going to be engaged by one way of learning that is the way that we like to learn.
Right. What do you wish more people understood about your own research?
Many people look at my research and rightfully think that I focus on students with disabilities. But the idea is that it's really focused on designing instruction for all kids. So the idea of inclusive instruction, and that UDL isn't just about students with disabilities, but it's certainly a step towards inclusion of kids with disabilities in computer science education. So I think that's one thing I wish people knew. The other thing I would say is that even though I use UDL because it seems to be catchy and people know about UDL, that there are a lot of other instructional strategies that I'm working on and that come from other areas. So For example, we do a lot of work on something called high leverage practices. And so these are like strategies that we know are impactful for kids with disabilities. And high leverage practices is something that is a well-known area in special education, but isn't as well known in computer science education, so that there's more to inclusion than just universal design for learning.
Yeah, I appreciate the nuance in that answer. I did a podcast episode where I unpacked a chapter by Thomas Rogalski, and he refers to a concept of methodolatry, which is an idea basically where you put on these blinders. You buy into a method at the all cost of not looking at anything else. And so there is a tendency for some people to look at something like UDL and go, okay, this is it. I don't need to look at anything else. And it's like, well, it depends on the context, and there's always more to learn and different approaches, and like UDL 10 years from now is going to look different because we're going to learn more, etc. So it's helpful to keep looking for expanding upon what you can currently do.
Yeah, exactly.
What has surprised you about your own research?
What surprised me is that people are so open to it. Maybe I was overly cynical coming into this community and my own assumptions about computer science education, kind of feeling like an outsider when I first came in, just feeling like I'm just a special ed person. Like here, they're using that word just again. Like, in this space, I felt like a real outsider and thinking about inclusion of kids with disabilities. What surprised me is that folks that I speak with get it. And they're like, we're in. This is great. Absolutely. CS for all means all. And what can we do? That to me has been really surprising in terms of just the acceptance of this work in the computer science education field. It shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. And within schools, there's been a lot of acceptance because there's such a critical need. And so teachers get it. But I was really pleasantly surprised that the research community has been so into this work as well.
Have you experienced any pushback on anything that you've recommended?
Yeah. So the pushback is all about implementation, right? So yes, we get it, inclusion, it's important, but it's going to take time. It's going to take resources. And this tool's not accessible. And designers don't want to do the work to make it accessible. And I won't put anybody under the bus there, but that's where the pushback comes, is like kind of in the implementation, because it's easy to say, yes, we're committed to inclusion, but what does it actually take to make that happen? Does the professional development that's offered to all kids actually prepare them to meet the needs of all students? Are the tools and curricula being evaluated based on accessibility? Is there time for teachers to work together and to collaborate around inclusion, like in co-teaching and co-planning? And so those are kind of systemic challenges that are difficult. So I understand that. And so I completely understand the pushback, but it's there. We're working on it.
Now, if you were handed a magic wand that allow you to change something about CS education, what change would you make and why?
Oof. There are many things I would do. The first is I would bring CS into pre-service in a much more active way. So thinking about what it takes for a computer science teacher to be successful in the classroom, we're often doing a lot of professional development because computer science teachers are new to computer science. But what if they actually came to computer science with some background? So even if you don't have a lot of computer science, at least having that exposure. And what if those pre-service programs teach CS from a UDL and accessibility perspective? So we're putting out computer science teachers or teachers who understand computing, who already have these mindsets in place and understand universal design for learning. To me, that would go a long way, so that then the professional development and the mentoring and induction that happens in schools doesn't have to start at 101.
Right.
And then at the same time, it would be really wonderful if all the fabulous PD that's happening around the country really considered inclusion and accessibility from the get-go, rather than as an add-on or like one session. But if you think about PD, you really want to talk about inclusion. It's got to be baked in, just like UDL is proactively baked into every lesson.
Right.
Having that baked into the PD so that it's not an add-on would go a really long way.
Yeah, I am curious to see how organizations like the nonprofit I work at is going to change 10 years from now, when like we have teachers coming into the workforce who actually have prior experience programming, whether it be in their K-12 tenure or in university level. Like it's going to completely change the way that organizations like us approach things. Because right now, the general assumption for most districts is there's very limited prior experience, if any.
Yeah, exactly. And that's changing. So CS for All has CS for Ed right now, Leanne Delizer's group, and they're advocating for funding for pre-service teacher preparation. And University of Florida, we've been really lucky to get one of these programs funded from the Griffin Foundation. So we're bringing computer science into pre-service teacher preparation and really thinking about UDL from the very beginning. And so for me, it's a start, but we need all these universities to jump on board too. So I'm really hoping that part of the work that we're going to get to do with the Griffin Initiative is to be able to develop some resources that we can share with other pre-service programs as well in this area, because there is such a need. But yeah, it will be interesting 5 years from now having this conversation and seeing how PD is shifting if we can do a really good job at the pre-service level with this.
Yeah. How do you practice or iterate on your own abilities, whether it's like in education or as a researcher or in computer science?
Well, there's not nearly enough time to do kind of the self-reflection and the self-learning that I need to do. But generally, a lot of the advice that I've given teachers is the advice that I try to take, which is connect with people, learn from the people around me, and read as much as I possibly can. And so conversations that I have with folks in other areas are informing the way that I conduct my research studies. And so, for example, coming into this work, I didn't have a lot of background in data analytics. It just wasn't part of my training in university. It wasn't part of my initial research studies. But doing the CS Ed research and being able to have access to things like log files allows me to really dig deep into kind of the behaviors and the problem solving that students engage in. And so it requires me to work with people who have that expertise and to extend my own understanding of, different sequence mining approaches that I'm not familiar with. And so I'm reading a lot of papers in areas that are new to me that are super exciting, but also I'm like, oh man, I've got to learn this whole new area. And that's okay because I don't have to know it all. I don't have to know it immediately. I have people I can go to, I can read, and I can ask questions. And so it really is that same advice that we were just talking about. Like, you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to find collaborators who will work with you and teach you, and you can hopefully teach them something too.
Yeah, I like that. Whenever we'd have like a new cohort of doc students come into the program, we would often have like just informal lunch conversations, and a question would always arise of like, what advice would you recommend? And from my perspective, the advice that I always gave was read outside of the field. It's great that you can cite like the seminal papers within music education, but it is so beneficial to read outside of the field, like to get these different perspectives and bring it in. Like that is beneficial for you as an individual, but it's also beneficial for the field. So being a professor is difficult in terms of like the workload that you have to do as a scholar, as an educator, etc. But then also being a professor who's exploring multiple domains and areas of study, it can be very draining. And just education in general is a hard field to work in. So I'm curious, how do you take care of yourself and try and prevent the burnout that can come working in a field like this?
I'll start by saying I feel like this is privileged work to be able to work in academia and ask the questions that I think are really important and engage with folks who also find those questions important. To me, it just feels like a privilege to get to do this kind of work. At the same time, like you said, it's a whole lot of privileged work. So it's a lot of work. And so I feel like you have to protect your time and you have to say no sometimes, which is difficult to do, especially in education when you're committed to systems change and students with disabilities. And so I don't know that I have a great answer for it, except for that I try to balance. And I don't always do a very good job of it. But, there are a few things I'm learning from my colleagues. Like I try really hard to not have meetings on Wednesdays, even though we're speaking on a Wednesday. I was able to spend this morning just doing work and not having a ton of meetings. And so I was able to actually like sit in the work. And sometimes what ends up happening is that we're so busy that we don't actually get to do the work. We're just running from meeting to meeting. And so carving out those times and protecting those times is really important. At the same time, also recognizing that there's life outside of work is also really important. And so what I try to do is, make sure that my entire identity isn't tied to being a researcher, faculty member. So
Mm.
I read a lot of fiction, things that have nothing to do with computer science.
Yep.
I try to get outside, all of those things that we know we have to do to kind of maintain that balance. It depends on the day and the week how well I do with it.
Yeah, I also have like a deep work practice in that I try and schedule about 2 hours at the start of the day before I have meetings, before I check email, where I'm just engaged in work on something, whatever it is that's like a big upcoming project. And that has been very helpful. The idea of like having an identity outside of work is something that I've had to work through with a therapist, like to try and reconcile that. And like now I'm like sharing my music and video game identities much more publicly, and I've never done that before. And that is like part of a process for me for like reconciling all these identities and just being more open and be like, hey, I don't just do computer science. I also do these other things, and they're a part of what makes me who I am.
Yeah, there's like an entire space on Instagram that is filled with people who are bookish people. And so it's like an amazing thing to connect with people on something that has nothing to do with computer science. And it's like completely nerdy, bookish conversations where you're like, I just read this amazing book. Who else has read it? And they're like, this is great. And what a gorgeous book cover. And so I think it's really healthy to do that. And it's also good to model that for our students too, who are coming in and they're, part of the grind and they're trying to get through their qualifying exams and to publish all the papers and to get their CVs ready so that they can be competitive. And so it's really important to recognize that that's not the only part of your life. When you look back on your life, nobody says, I don't think, I wish I'd worked more, right? So the work's important. The work is privileged, but it's not the only thing that makes up your life.
Yeah, my first therapist had experience working in hospice, and that was one of the things that she had said to me, and it did not really connect with me when I heard it at the time. This was during undergrad and when I was like really getting started with career, etc., and I was so driven, but now I'm like, oh, I get what she was saying many years ago.
Yeah, and those people are amazing folks who do that work, talk about difficult but necessary and absolutely critical work for people and their families. So yeah, I could see they definitely need to disengage from that because it's the emotional toll of that is something.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've been to it, but I have a colleague who recommends Goodreads. It's a website that is...
Oh yeah.
Okay, so you're on it?
I'm all in for Goodreads. Oh yeah, I'm on. You can find me.
What recommendations do you have for improving equity and inclusion in CS education?
So one of the things I would do is look for the CSTA standards for CS teachers and their advocacy and equity standards. I think that's a really good place for us to go to in thinking about how to improve our own professional learning when it comes to access and inclusion. Those standards were written to support teachers along the trajectory from like being a brand new teacher all the way through, teachers who've been doing this for a while. But the idea of using those standards and reflecting on those standards in your own practice, like, are we minimizing threats to inclusion, for example? Are we, looking at accessible materials? So I think that that's a really good place to go to if you're trying to improve your practice. And then you can pull out the resources that are available and then, be more strategic in terms of how you're addressing that within your own practice.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to include a link to those in the show notes. What do you wish there's more research on that could inform your own practices?
I wish there were more longitudinal studies. So the way that research is currently funded doesn't really allow for that. So if we do work with kids at the elementary level and we see their learning and engagement increase, what does that look like for that student as they move from elementary to middle to high school to post-high school career decisions? To me is critical because knowing where those points are, those pain points, is important, but we really don't know. And so I can tell you at a snapshot in time what's working and not working for a child or a teacher in a classroom. but I really cannot tell you anything about the long-term outcomes of that. To me, that's critical. And we have these in disciplines that have been around longer, like in terms of mathematics education. There are some of these more longitudinal studies, but even in those fields, those are difficult to do. To me, that's an area that I really wish we had. It would inform my practice a whole lot. The other thing I wish I had is very fine-grained data around the participation of students with disabilities in different programs. So it's very difficult to get that because of obviously we have to protect the confidentiality of students, and it's really important to do that. But knowing, for example, who's in computer science, not just by gender, which we have, or socioeconomics or race, ethnicity, but also by disability status would be really helpful. And we're getting some of that in school districts where we have some data agreements, but having wide scale data and not just disability, but let's just say learning disability versus autism versus behavior disorder, and then intersectional data. If you happen to be a girl with a behavior disorder who is from a rural environment, right? Those are intersections that make a difference because disability doesn't live in isolation, and humans aren't like one thing. We're like these complex intersectional beings. I really wish we had that data, because if I knew what that data was, I would be able to look at systems change in a more proactive way. We're doing some of that, like I said, right now as part of the UDL for CS project, but it's really tedious, slow work because this data is not readily available.
Yeah, that would be nice. We're in some of the upcoming grants I'm doing, we're trying to get more dialed in, more fine-tuned with that data, but it's like even NCES data doesn't like differentiate outside of the binary of male and female for gender. So like we're not even there yet, let alone getting into different types of disabilities and whatnot. So much to improve there.
Yeah, we have a long way to go.
Right.
It would make a huge difference, though, having that kind of data. Because, I mean, it was so helpful with the AP data. So, thinking about Barb Erickson's work, for example, it's great to be able to have that metric that she has for the APCS courses and to be able to look at that over time and then to see change in that as we do more to include more girls, to include more people from different backgrounds.
Right.
We just aren't there yet with disability. And we may not be because of the protections that are in place.
Yeah. Well, and then with the longitudinal side of things, like you were mentioning, funding doesn't support it, but also the tenure process doesn't necessarily support longitudinal. It supports quantity of publication. And so people tend to go with short studies or surveys rather than something longitudinal.
Absolutely. So I'm, like I said, very privileged to already have tenure. So I have the time, luckily, but those early studies, those first kind of hustle years, you definitely can't take the time to do long-term studies because you have to get as many out. And I mean, obviously they have to be quality studies, but you can't actually, it's very chancy to do longitudinal work when you have to produce a lot of research studies.
Right. What's something that you're working on that you could use help with from a listener?
If there are listeners out there who are doing work with students with disabilities in computer science education, I'd love to hear about that, because one of the things I want to be able to do is highlight stories. So thinking about, what are strategies and, knowing the barriers that we've talked about, what are some ways that teachers or schools or school districts are overcoming some of those barriers that others can learn from. To me, that would be amazing, because collecting those stories and highlighting that work to me would be really impactful. I think that would be fantastic. I'd love to highlight and elevate those stories.
What questions do you have for myself or for the field?
I think questions for the field are like, what do folks need in order to help them include students with disabilities? So there are some things that I know, but like we talked about earlier, the things we know are the things that we see in front of us.
Right.
And so being able to say, for folks who are really committed to this, what are the pain points and what are the barriers that they're facing would be really helpful. It also would be important or helpful to know in situations that are working well. This kind of goes back to the last thing. What is it that they're doing that's working really well? Because we want to learn from that as well. To me, that's as important as understanding what the barriers are, because there's good work happening and we want to learn from that as well. And then what would it take for them to be able to include kids with disabilities? So is it that they need more PD? Is it that they need advocacy at the state level, or, whatever it is that folks feel like they need that they're not getting? Those are things that would be helpful for me to know. So right now I have this CS for All research practice partnership with several large school districts where we're trying to understand what those barriers are and trying to understand what some of those pathways are as well. And so any of those types of that kind of knowledge would be really helpful to gather as part of this work.
Cool. So where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
Yep. So you can find me at the Creative Technology Research Lab at the University of Florida. I'm also on Twitter at misrael09. But generally, if you look me up at the University of Florida, you'll be able to find my work there.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. I really hope you enjoyed listening to this interview, and I hope you consider sharing with somebody else who might also enjoy listening to this interview. Friendly reminder, you can find the show notes at jaredoleary.com, as well as a bunch of other resources related to CS education, drumming, and gaming. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or would recommend a guest, you can press the Contact Me button on my website, as I'm always looking to find more guests. Stay tuned next week for another episode, and until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.